here. Chip gave me a very difficult topic. I'm sorry. I don't know how to send it back, but what does 100% renewable look like? And, okay. So I'm an energy economist based in Durango, Colorado, and what I'm going to show you today in a very brief 15 minutes represents probably tens of thousands of hours of techno-economic analysis. I'm a numbers guy. I'm going to show you a lot of pictures, and I'm barely going to scrape the surface. But the whole purpose of the exercise is that what 100% renewable looks like is it depends. It depends on the policy. And I think the discussion that came before me and the presenters that came before me have laid a very good groundwork for what I'm going to show you. In my kind of numbers-oriented world, it's important that we look at the cost drivers and what are the numbers behind the different technologies that we can bring to bear to get towards 100% renewable. So identifying those technology-specific attributes, there are multiple technologies that can solve specific problems, quantify those values, rank those technologies by the value that they provide to the system, and then that will contribute to the minimum cost achievement of our goals. And as the situation changes, we reiterate the process. So it's all about getting there in the most cost-effective manner possible. So this was this was part of a CPUC proceeding in California prior to the implementation of the California Solar Initiative. And it was important because it attempted to quantify different attributes, to quantify the value of the different attributes of rooftop photovoltaics. Again, this is before the California Solar Initiative was implemented. And the whole idea was to provide a bottom line range of value that policymakers could rely on to support ratepayer funding for the California Solar Initiative. By separating the value of the different attributes, if you are a skeptic of any one of those values, you can throw that value out and it won't impact the value of the other attributes. So, of course, the California Solar Initiative was over a $2 billion program over 10 years. Very successful, so successful that we now see the infamous California duck curve. We have more and more solar during the solar peak in the middle of the day, and we have less and less net load that the California Independent System Operator has to satisfy. I don't know if that's going to go that far. So we get this kind of belly of the duck, and this is causing significant issues on the California grid, because now we need significant downward ramping when the sun comes up, and even more significant upward ramping when the sun goes down and the evening peak occurs. And we've also seen the impact of this on prices, and Brian references earlier. In the spring particularly, we're seeing almost 10% in May of last year, 10% of the 5-minute increments where we're seeing negative pricing on the California wholesale market. We see similar things in Texas with respect to the wind supplies, the oversupply of wind. Now, Brian also mentioned that we're at about 34% renewables in California. I do a lot of work with the University of California at Irvine, and most of the rest of the results that I'm going to present have been developed in association with my colleagues there. So this is from the dissertation of Josh Eichmann, who's now at NREL. And the purpose was, what does 33% renewables look like when 33% was the goal in California? So at the time we started this, we were under 10% renewables. And you can see the dark black line is the load. The kind of golden are the load-following generators that are required. And the yellow are the peakers, the requirement for those peak loads when the load followers can't meet them. So this was below 10%. As we move to doubling that to over 20%, you can see kind of in the purpley blue the wind and solar impact at meeting the load. We're starting to see some curtailment in the red during the periods when the grid can't handle it. And then you see we are actually getting more peaking during the, for purposes of those ramping periods. And then as we move closer and closer to the 23%, as Brian was alluding to, we see more and more curtailment. And the load followers are operating at their very, very minimum. And we get this incredible amount of curtailment. And so the question becomes, what do we do with all of that curtailed energy? And of course, we've talked about, the previous speakers talked about the possibility of creating hydrogen at a large scale. Now, this is analysis that we completed about a year ago, but it's an ongoing effort, where we looked at what's the levelized, we call it the levelized cost of returned energy. So we assumed, because of all that curtailment, that the input cost of the electricity would be zero. Now, the numbers would obviously go up if that was different, but we wanted to see what were the conversion costs of these different pathways for hydrogen. And you can see, we did assume that everything started with an electrolyzer. We've got the hydrogen going directly into the natural gas pipeline. We've got the possibility of methanating, which then leads to no limitation other than the capacity of the pipeline for putting that renewable fuel into the pipeline system. We've got the fueling on the hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And then one of the more interesting results, at least early on, is what happens if we put that into a legacy natural gas combined cycle. And the whole idea of the HERO technology, drop it in there and then gets to the point of we can use hydrogen for the, kind of in the standard legacy plants, which I think is very exciting technology. The idea of this was really to compare batteries against hydrogen, and you can see in that case we actually have some overlap in the costs, even at current costs. Of course, if we go to future costs, we have learning curve numbers in there, and we see more and more overlapping values. And you can see for the hydrogen fueling, particularly in the high-cost gasoline states, we have a pretty competitive situation at the low end of the cost curve. And the cost range is because we looked at a whole bunch of different technologies, different batteries, different electrolyzers, different fuel cells. Okay, my colleague Sarah Wang, as a PhD student, she took that one step further and said, let's add battery electric vehicles to this and look at compare them to the fuel cell electric vehicles and battery energy storage. And what she did was she looked at the investment cost of reducing those greenhouse gas emissions. So what's the cost per ton of greenhouse gas emissions that are removed based on these different technologies? And this was using the same model that was used in the previous results, but focusing now on greenhouse gas emissions. And what she found was you want to be putting your hydrogen fuel into vehicles, or into vehicles, or you want to be putting that electricity directly into the battery electric vehicles. And she looked at 3 different charging systems: immediate charging, where you just plug it in when you get where you're going; smart charging, where you adjust your charging to the situation on the grid; and then the vehicle-to-grid charging, where you're actually feeding it both directions in order to try and maximize the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see on the far right that vehicle-to-grid charging, the smarter you are on your charging, the more low cost your greenhouse gas emissions abatement is. And part of that is because you are avoiding gasoline emissions rather than the natural gas emissions from the grid. And of course, as the grid gets cleaner and cleaner, the benefits of battery electric vehicles and putting that grid electricity into batteries, you lose some of the value of greenhouse gas emissions because the grid electricity is getting cleaner and cleaner over time. So that's why you need the iterative process on your analyses, because the grid is always changing, the cost of the technologies are changing over time, and the potential best least cost solution is changing also. So looking then at vehicles, and Ryan also alluded to this, another colleague, Jeff Reed, is looking at, so what does the low cost fuel standard program, what does that credit value have to be to get to gasoline cost parity for fuel cell electric vehicles. And you can see, and also Brian mentioned the dairies and their negative carbon intensity. So you can see that they require less of an LCFS credit over time. But the point is that at the current LCFS credit prices, which are approaching the limit of $200, all of these technologies for fuel cell electric vehicles could be made cost effective. And again, we've got the biomass limitations will limit some of that. And the bottom line there, the timing depends on the policy. So prior to hydrogen fueling stations being eligible for the LCFS, other colleagues at UC Irvine, we worked on a project that said, how much upfront support would we need from policymakers to make a network of 68 hydrogen fueling stations economic? And this was done back in 2011 and 12, and another group within the UC Irvine Advanced Power and Energy Program had identified these 68 fueling stations as a critical, kind of a critical mass of what would be needed. You see them concentrated in the Bay Area and of course Southern California with some connecting stations between them. And what we found was, regardless of what we assumed in terms of the percentage of the base case hydrogen electric vehicle kind of uptake, market uptake, we had a fair amount of required support, but in all cases, the total potential profits, and this is all on a net present value basis, exceeded the cost of the required upfront support. So it kind of goes to that idea that we are going to need, in many cases, some upfront support for these technologies that are not yet cost effective in order to bring the technologies into the market, have the capacity increases that will bring down the costs over time. So the 1/10 is actually more closer to where we are today. This was based on 100,000 vehicles and fuel cell electric vehicles in 2020. And today we have under 10,000, and we only have 39 stations that have been built. But again, just the idea that that there is profitability to be had if you can get over that kind of death chasm for the non-cost-effective technologies early on. And so, 100% renewable does depend, in my mind, on well-informed policy to get there in a cost-effective manner. And what it looks like, who knows? Whatever it looks like, I think if we can get there with good policy and at the least cost, we all benefit from the effort. Thank you very much.